Cool. I will try to get that out of my screen. It's blocking everything. And all right. Well, with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Cristina Lazcano, soil health professor or soils professor at UC Davis, once at Cal Poly, and she was gracious enough to give us a presentation a couple years back during the beginning of the implementation of this project. And we're always happy to have Dr. Lazcano share her knowledge. So with that, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm gonna share my screen, and please let me know if you can see everything in my full screen. And can you see the screen? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction. And it was actually really good to hear about your projects and the results that you're getting, because it's somehow related to what I'm going to be talking about here. So I'm going to talk about the benefits of cover crops for soil health, a little bit in general, but I also want to highlight a bit of the research gaps that exist and why what we're doing, it's important, both by the RCD and also some of the projects that I have been working on recently. So just starting very general, as you all know, recently there has been an increased interest in soil health and preserving the health of soils, because there's also an increased awareness by industry and by society of the importance of soils, not just for producing food, but for supporting environmental quality and for regulating climate in the long term. And so because of these, there are several initiatives at the local, the state, federal level, and even international initiatives that are trying to restore soil health. And one of the most popular that has been supporting a lot of our research is the CDFA, the Healthy Soils Program, which aims to support farmers and ranchers to adopt sustainable soil management practices that at the same time that they enhance soil health by increasing soil organic matter, they also reduce environmental impacts by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing carbon sequestration. So what is soil health? And this is a definition that everybody knows. The continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that supports plants, animals, and humans. And what I like to say is that, in other words, a healthy soil is a soil that functions and that provides the services that soils are supposed to provide to society. And so soil health is somehow a new concept, which is not that new. It kind of builds on this concept of soil quality that was better known by growers perhaps, but there's a little bit of a difference, which is related to the fact that soil health, that concept emphasizes the living component of soils that support the processes that soils provide, right? So the concept of soil quality kind of includes a little bit more static soil properties, like a certain soil fertility, a certain soil nutrient content, certain texture. But the concept of soil health really emphasizes the capacity of soil to provide those nutrients, for example, right? Or to generate a certain soil structure that will promote carbon sequestration and crop growth. So what are the properties or services that are associated to healthy soils? These properties can be classified into more agronomic properties, which is what you can see here in green, like supporting high yields or crop quality. Diversity related properties, like holding diverse soil organisms or supporting the activity of soil biota. Environmental related benefits, like the storage of carbon or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, supplying nutrients to crops, but also retaining nutrients, and then supporting a certain type of soil physical properties, like the storage of water or promoting infiltration of water. these properties or services can be measured with a series of what we call soil health indicators. Like when you go to the doctor and they do this metabolic panel and you get your glucose and different other parameters. So there's different things you can measure in soils to assess these different functions. And I'm really sorry, there's like a landscaper outside of my house blowing leaves, so I apologize in advance. Anyway, yields can obviously be measured by the harvested crop area. If we want to assess crop quality, then we can measure different things. In the case of grapes, then we measure phenolics or tannins, etc. Diversity and activity of soil biota can be assessed also with different techniques, like using genetic markers, the PLFAs that Andrea just mentioned, or also measure microbial respiration. Environmental functions can be measured by assessing total soil organic carbon in the soil to assess carbon sequestration or the release of greenhouse gases directly from soils. We can measure the capacity of soils to retain nutrients by assessing mineralization rates or nitrification rates. And obviously nutrient supply can be measured by just determining the amounts of the nutrients in the soil. And then water storage can be assessed through water holding capacity, and infiltration rates can be measured directly. So a warning message here is that the properties and indicators of soil health that are going to be targeted through management are usually way differently for different crops, because different crops have also different needs. And also there are site-specific challenges that are going to require that certain soil properties are managed more in detail than others. So what this means is that the meaning of soil health may be different for different contexts. And for example, what we need out of a soil to grow crops like corn is different of what we need to grow crops like grapes, and specifically wine grapes. And so that means that the definition of soil health is different depending on the crop. So for example, for growing corn, we need a lot of crop. Corn is a crop that needs quite a lot of nutrients. So what we need out of a soil, it's a soil that supports high yield. In the case of wine grapes, we want to support yields, but we're also interested in a specific chemical profile in the grapes. So we want a certain quality. So the focus is more on quality rather than on yields. In the case of corn, we want a soil that it's able to supply enough nutrients that will support that yield. But we don't want those nutrients to be lost to the environment. So we also want a soil that is able to retain the nutrients. In the case of wine grapes, we don't want to have so many nutrients or such a high amount of nutrients in the soil, because that will increase vigor of the plants and will potentially have consequences for quality or yield of the grapes. So that is different. And in addition to that, because we are in California, which is a region which has different climate and precipitation rates than the Midwest, where corn is grown, we want a soil that is able to store and retain water, right? Because we are subjected to droughts and that we have limitations in water supply. So that means that we need a better definition of what soil health means for wine grapes. And unfortunately, most of the indicators and management practices and recommendations have been defined for crops like corn and areas like the Midwest, and not for crops like wine grapes or areas like California. So we need to define soil health for wine grape production. And I want to highlight that the importance of soil for wine grape production is nothing new. So this is something that has already been included in the concept of terroir, which defines the effects of soils when combined with the climate, topography, and grape variety on the quality of wine. But the concept of soil health is slightly different than the concept of terroir. So here in this kind of orange circle, you can see the properties that are typically considered as components of the terroir. And those are mostly inherent soil properties that are not dynamic, that are not typically affected by management, like soil depth, the mineralogy, cation exchange capacity, texture, drainage, or pH. And indicators of soil health, some of them are shared with what was considered traditionally within the terroir, like structure, infiltration, water holding capacity, or nitrogen supply, but some of them are new and they have never been considered before as part of the terroir. For example, soil organic carbon, microbial activity. Okay, somebody's on the weight room, I'm going to admit. Okay, good. These new parameters that we're talking about now that are very important components of soil health, like carbon, microbial diversity, microbial activity, etc., have never been considered as part of the terroir. So at the same time that managing for soil health might be an opportunity to allow for the full expression of the terroir, we're also managing for other soil properties and might have an impact on wine grape quality. And so we should consider whether these properties need to be included within the definition of terroir. And in particular, I want to emphasize the important role of soil biota and the soil microbiome in producing wine grapes. We know that the microbiome is important for cycling nutrients, for fighting diseases, for sequestering carbon, and also potentially for the fermentation of wines. A lot of the yeast that it's used in wine fermentation is actually coming from soils. And we know that microbes in the soil are transferred directly to the grapes through the vines. So those are all questions that we are currently working on. And this is a project that is supported by the American Vineyard Foundation. And we are working on this in collaboration with Upper Salinas Las Tablas RCD. This is a project that is just starting this year. We're also working with the Lodi Wine Commission and Napa Valley Grape Grower Association to kind of try to define what soil health means for wine grape production. And to do that, we are kind of following two approaches. We have a social science approach. So we're doing semi-structured interviews to growers and vineyard managers to kind of get their perception of the definition of soil health. And then we're going to their vineyards and collecting soil samples to kind of compare their perception of soil health with biophysical parameters. So in this way, we're hoping to get a better definition of soil health for wine grape production. So this is part of the research that we're working on, but we're also working quite a lot on management strategies to support soil health for wine grape production. And this is going to be the second part of my talk. And so when we talk about supporting soil health, there are three main principles, like three pillars of soil health management. One of them is increasing soil organic matter, and this can be done in different ways. One of the most direct ways of increasing soil organic matter is the use of organic fertilizers like compost, manure, or sewage sludge. Another way is using cover crops or incorporating crop residues. The second principle is reduction in disturbance. And so for that, we can keep the soil covered by using cover crops. We can reduce tillage by using no-till or low-till management. And we can manage the vegetation cover either through grazing or through mowing. And then the third principle is increasing diversity within cropping systems. And this can be done in a couple different ways. by using crop rotations, which in the case of perennials is difficult. But in the case of perennials, the best strategy to increase diversity within the cropping system is the use of cover crops in the interrows. So as you can see, cover crops are included in these three categories, right? They actually fulfill these three main principles. So in the next slides, I'm going to show a few examples on how cover crops are supporting soil health by affecting all of these functions of a healthy soil. The most direct way and the most obvious way in which cover crops protect or support soil health is by keeping the soil covered and reducing disturbance of soil erosion. And this is probably the main reason why cover crops are used by most growers so far. Cover crops protect soils from the damage that rain produces, and so they avoid erosion and runoff. And with that, the loss of soil, right? So they're directly affecting soil health, but by preserving soils in the first place. Soil cover crops also have an impact on the physical properties of soils. Certain cover crops have very large root systems that can be used to create pores in soils that have compaction issues or that have a very fine texture and therefore have problems with infiltration. So cover crops like radish or certain types of carrots, they can be used to break the soil apart and generate cracks. Cover crop roots are also directly involved in generating aggregates in the soils. And this is a very nice picture that shows how the roots are kind of enclosing the soil particles and bringing them together, right, to form these little soil aggregates. Soil aggregates are important because they sequester carbon, but they also provide habitat for soil biota. So they are essential for soil health. Cover crops have a direct effects on the soil biota. And so this is an example of a study that it was a meta-analysis. That means an analysis of the published literature up to 2020. And so throughout the literature, this paper showed that cover crops have beneficial effects for the abundance of soil microorganisms, for the activity of soil microorganisms, and also for the diversity of microorganisms. Although the effects were stronger when considering the abundance and activity of microorganisms as compared to diversity. So I'm going to explain this chart a little bit because it might be a bit difficult to understand. This dashed line here, this vertical dashed line, represents the effects of a controlled treatment without cover crops on all of these different parameters, the abundance, activity, and diversity of microorganisms. And then these error bars here represent the main effects of cover crops as shown by the studies, the published literature, right? So anything on the right of this dashed line represents a positive effect, so an increase in these parameters here. So this would be colony forming units, for example, which is a measurement of abundance of microorganisms. This would be microbial biomass carbon. It's another measurement of abundance of microorganisms. This would be microbial biomass nitrogen, and here's PLFA abundance, right? So throughout the board, the published literature shows that cover crops increase the abundance of microorganisms as shown by all of these different indicators. The effects are slightly weaker when we consider diversity, but they are still positive effects. So this is in regards of the microbiome, but we also know that cover crops have benefits for the whole food web. This is a study that we actually carried out in the Central Coast in the Etna Valley in San Luis Obispo County. We went and took samples from the tractor row and the vine row within the vineyard. The tractor row in this case was it had a cover crop, the vineyard didn't. And so what we've seen is that the tractor row had a significantly higher abundance of nematodes than the vine row. While this doesn't sound very attractive, right? People don't usually want to have nematodes. I want to also specify that we found a difference in diversity of nematodes between the two locations. So the tractor row not only had more nematodes, but also had more beneficial nematodes as compared to the vine row. The vine row had a higher proportion of plant parasitic nematodes as compared to the tractor row. And we attribute these differences to the presence of cover crop, which is supporting the whole food web. So here in these pie charts, you see the relative proportion of different trophic groups, different types of nematodes. So in orange, you got the herbivores, which are typically the bad guys, right? The plant parasitic nematodes are the ones that nobody wants. So the proportion of those was lower in the tractor row as compared to the fungivores and the bacterivores, which have beneficial properties for soil health. And as you can see here in the vine row, the proportion of these plant parasitic nematodes was much higher. So cover crops have a direct effect on the soil microbiome, but also at the whole food web level. And probably one of the most important benefits of cover crops is associated with the input of organic matter and the input of carbon to soils. And cover crops represent a direct input of carbon, not just through above ground litter, but probably most importantly through below ground litter incorporations. And this figure here illustrates the fact that most of the biomass on these plant species is actually located below ground, right? So the most important contribution of cover crops to soil carbon, it's going to be associated with the roots. And not just like the contribution of roots directly through litter inputs, right? But the contribution of roots through exudation of carbon. So while the plant is living, plants or cover crops are constantly producing exudates that are releasing to the soil through the roots. This is what it's sometimes called as liquid carbon. Exudates are typically very labile forms of carbon that are food sources for the soil microbiome. And by improving microbial activity and microbial biomass, are going to be contributed indirectly to carbon sequestration, because microbial residues are really important in sequestration of carbon. So overall, cover crops are really important in putting carbon into the soil. Cover crops sequester CO2 from the atmosphere that they use to produce their own biomass, either above ground or below ground. That carbon is going to be used by soil biota, the soil microbiome, and eventually contribute to the pool of soil carbon and nitrogen. However, we need to consider that in this process of decomposition, naturally, there are certain gases that are being produced that are greenhouse gases. Those are CO2, which is a product of microbial respiration, but also nitrous oxide and methane. And nitrous oxide and methane actually have larger contribution to global warming because the global warming potential is much higher than CO2. So at the same time that we want to use cover crops to put carbon into the soil, we need to be careful on how we manage those cover crops. So we keep this balance towards improving soil carbon, and we don't increase the emission of greenhouse gases. So in this sense, there are different decisions, critical decisions and critical time points when it comes to management cover crops. And one of the most important is the termination of cover crops. We are not in the business of growing cover crops, right? And as we all know, if the winter is good and precipitation is high, cover crops can grow a lot. And eventually when we get to a bad break, the vines needs to start getting water and nutrients, and they're gonna be competing with the cover crops. So we really need to terminate the cover crop, right, at this point. And this is actually one of the most critical decisions that will affect the benefits of cover crops. The options here are using a herbicide, and this is something that is used by many growers, right? The advantage is that it's very effective, but it has very clear disadvantages, which are non-desired effects to soil biota, but also to human health. So because of these reasons, many growers are actually moving away from this and using other alternatives. So one of the alternatives to terminate and incorporate cover crops is using tillage, usually in combination with mowing. Tillage, it is really good in promoting the mixing of a cover crop with soil, and in that way, by mixing the cover crop residue with the soil, it's actually improving the access of microorganisms to the cover crop and promoting the breakdown and incorporation of the cover crop into the soil. It is also supposed to increase infiltration and aeration in certain types of soils, which have very high contents of clay. So there are benefits to the use of tillage, but there are also disadvantages, which is the fact that using too much tillage or tilling the soil too much can actually disrupt soil structure to a point where aggregates are broken, and we kind of disrupt that balance between inputs and outputs of carbon. And so we promote more outputs of carbon from the soil than inputs. So we actually may be promoting the loss of carbon from the soil. And it's very difficult to know where that tipping point is, right? So because of that, many growers are moving to no-till or reduced till, which it's known to have benefits for soil structure, and also promote the increase in soil organic matter in the long term. There are benefits for soil biota as well, and the transition to no-till or reduction in tillage intensity typically promotes the increase in the abundance of certain soil microorganisms like fungi, and all of the organisms in the food web that are associated with the increase in fungal abundance. For example, the increase in fungivorm nematodes, the increase in collembolan, etc. Other types of macrofauna are also benefited from no-till systems, like earthworms. Earthworms are directly affected by tillage, right? Because tillage disrupts soil structure, but also directly damages the blades of the tillage can actually directly damage earthworms. So there are benefits, known benefits of no-till. But no-till may be an issue in certain types of soils. Many growers mention that if they have a really heavy clay soils, they need to use tillage to improve infiltration. And even if you use no-till, you still need to cut or terminate the cover crop somehow, right? So what are the alternatives if you are going to no-till? You can mow or roll the cover crop. This can have advantages by promoting, creating a mulching effect, which protects the soil from soil erosion, but the incorporation of the organic matter to the soil is slower. Many growers are also incorporating sheep grazing as a way of managing cover crops and terminating the cover crop in no-till systems, right? Grazing has also advantages. It promotes soil fertility by incorporating manure in the sheep feces. Those are nitrogen additions that might actually improve soil fertility. And it's known that the right amount of grazing pressure, it might actually stimulate cover crop growing and the production of root exudates that stimulates the soil microbiome and carbon sequestration. But grazing needs to be done in the right way, because too much grazing can lead to overgrazing, compaction in the soil. And the same increase in nitrogen that may be beneficial for soil fertility might actually lead to increases in greenhouse gas emissions like nitrous oxide, and there can also be methane be produced. So these are all questions that we are working on right now. We started a trial also with support from the CDFA Healthy Soils program. This is a project that started in 2018, and actually we're just wrapping up analyzing the last samples. And the objective of this specific trial that I'm going to talk about was to determine the best combination of grazing and tillage management practices that will maximize benefits to soil health and grape quality while reducing these environmental impacts, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this trial was carried out at Tablas Creek Vineyard. And as you know, this is a vineyard that it's in Paso Robles. It follows biodynamic management. This specific trial was carried out in a Syrah block. And we follow a full factorial design combining tillage and grazing. So if you can see, this is an aerial picture of the trial. And so we had the tillage treatments in rows. So here, these dashed lines will represent no-till, and then next to it, white full lines will represent blocks of tilled vine rows. So they were alternating. And then overlaid, we had grazing enclosures. So we install fencing across these tilled and no-till rows, where 2 times a year we introduce the sheep and a pretty high density. For only a few hours, this was done, I think, over 2 or 3 hours. And so the sheep were moved from one plot to the other one, and they consumed most of the cover crop. And so it was a relatively short, it's high intensity, short duration grazing event. So within each of the experimental plots, we collected samples from 2 years. We started in 2018 actually to 2020. And we collected soil samples, gas samples, and also plant samples at harvest time from 2 different locations within the plot. So we collected soils and gas samples from under the vines and also from the tractor rows. And the assumption was that the tractor rows typically receive the tillage, where the vines, they don't. And also the vines receive water, whereas the tractor doesn't receive water, supplemented water. So we also expected to see differences in soil health and greenhouse gas emissions in the 2 locations. So in the soil samples, we analyzed total carbon, active carbon. We also measure nitrogen, aggregate size distribution, water holding capacity, and we are performing analysis of the microbiome. The gas samples were analyzed for CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane. And in the grape samples that we collected at harvest, we measured yields and also certain quality parameters, anthocyanins, phenolics, malic acid, and TA, total acidity. So we are still working on this data set, but I have some preliminary data to show you. And I'll start showing you by the effects of cover crop termination strategies in soil carbon. This is data from the second year of the study. And so this is showing the percentage of soil carbon at 2 soil depths. So we have a first depth interval from 0 to 6 inches, and then the second from 6 to 12 inches. And here the different colors represent tilled treatments in orange and no tilled in green, either mowed or grazed. So the first thing that we notice here is that topsoil had more carbon, and this is something that is expected, and it happens pretty much everywhere. Most of the carbon is accumulated in the top 6 inches of the soil, whereas the bottom layer of soil had lower soil carbon. And another thing is that after 2 years of practice implementation, we did not see any effects on total soil carbon. No surprise here either. It usually takes a long time to see changes in total soil carbon. We analyzed other forms of soil carbon, and we did not see effects of grazing. We did see an effect of tillage in active carbon. Tillage seemed to increase the percentage of active carbon in the soil. This other chart is showing you the change and the evolution on nitrous oxide emissions through the whole study. And I apologize in advance. I know there's a lot of information shown in this graph, but I'm going to kind of explain it. So on the right, this part of the chart is showing the evolution in greenhouse gas emissions in tilled plots. On the left, these are no-till plots. On the top, it's the change in nitrous oxide emissions in the rows. The bottom is showing the vine rows, so the soil under the vine. And within each graph, orange color shows grazing plots, and gray shows non-grazing plots. So soils that were not subjected to grazing. And then these are emissions measured at different dates from the start of the experiment in 2018 over to fall of 2020, right? So this is over the course of 2 years. What we observed, as you see, there was a lot of variability in nitrous oxide emissions, and we did see that grazing led to certain peaks that were very localized at certain times, and especially during the rainy season. Grazing seemed to trigger an increase in nitrous oxide emissions. However, the contribution of these emissions to the overall cumulative emissions of the whole season was not significant. So in spite of the presence of these very punctual and localized peaks of nitrous oxide that were caused by grazing, overall, the greenhouse gas budget was not affected because the emissions that were produced by other events in the background were overall larger than grazing. So grazing did not really lead to increased emissions of this greenhouse gas. When we looked at yields, applying these treatments, either grazing or till, the different tillage treatments, also did not have an effect on the yields of this vineyard. Neither in the kilograms produced per vine or the number of clusters per vine. So we are working right now on analyzing the grape quality parameters, and so we might see some trends here, some effects of the treatments on grape quality, but honestly, I doubt it. And so to wrap up, in this particular case, management of cover crops through no-till did not increase soil carbon in the short term as compared to tillage. And then the reasons for this is that this soil, in this particular case, had already a pretty high background content of soil organic matter. So the benefits of transitioning to no-till in this particular case in the short term may be very small. Yields were not affected by tillage or by grazing either. And when we looked at greenhouse gas emissions, we saw that in the short term, there are no trade-offs of managing the cover crops through grazing and no-till. So I kind of in the same line as what Andrew mentioned for their trial before, our experiment did not really show significant effects to soil health or to greenhouse gas emissions in the short term. However, it is expected that in the long term, soil carbon will increase, but this still needs to be investigated. And I will actually want to make a case for long-term studies that will assess the real effects of these treatments on soil health and potential environmental trade-offs. So this kind of takes me to the last point that I want to make in this presentation, which is like the open research questions and research gaps that we need to address. And so while we know that the certain practices like compost, no-till, and cover crops might have certain benefits for soil health, then the actual outcomes of these practices seem to be very variable depending on the location, depending on the duration of the trials, etc. And actually this makes it really difficult to predict the potential impacts for grape quality, right? So there's a lot of uncertainties that we still need to solve. One of them is the duration of these trials, right? We need to see what the long-term effects are. The other one, it's like practices are typically not standardized across different trials. So for example, this is an example of another study that was published by Carrie Steenworth and her research team. It's like, this was a study that they did in Napa Valley across different vineyards that were using cover crops. And what they've seen is that the type of cover crop has a very direct and distinct impact on the soil microbiome. So depending on the type of cover crop that you're using, you might have a different microbial community. And this actually may affect soil carbon sequestration and grape quality and grape yields on a different way, right? So there is also a lot of variability in the practices that growers are using. So we need to somehow also solve this uncertainty. Large part of the uncertainty too is associated to the soil type. We know for sure the carbon sequestration, it's very different depending on the texture of the soil, for example. And so the benefits of cover crops for soil carbon are actually going to depend whether you're growing the cover crop in a high clay soil or in a coarse texture soil. And we know that wine growing regions, for example, this is Napa Valley, and this was another study that was published in 2015. Within the same growing region, there's a high variety of soil types, which also have really large differences in soil carbon levels. So we need to standardize this, and also we need to know what are the ranges of variability for different soil health indicators for all of these different soil types, right? So I'm going to go back to that first project that I mentioned that we are going to start working on this year in collaboration with the Upper Salinas Las Tablas RCD, where we have been working in Napa Valley for the last year, but this year we're going to be focusing specifically on Paso Robles. And the purpose of this project is to assess the variability in soil health indicators across different types in Paso Robles, because we know that in Paso there are very, very different soil types. Depending on where you are, you might have a very fine texture, very coarse texture, high pH, low pH soil. And that might actually determine how much organic matter you can accumulate and therefore the benefits of the cover crop that you're going to see. So it's important to establish benchmark values for soil health indicators across different soil types. And so if any of you, I'm not sure if there are growers in this meeting, but if anybody is interested in participating in this project, we're going to start contacting growers for these interviews and soil sampling and soil health assessment that we're starting this year. So if you're interested, please reach out to me. This is my email, or you can also contact Andy at the Upper Salinas Las Tablas RCD. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Lazcano. That was fantastic, as always. That's the first time I've seen that presentation, and I think that it did a spectacular job of outlining some of the difficulties that both of our organizations are finding in gathering a lot of solid data based on long-term collection. Let's definitely open it up to questions. I did have a couple of questions that came up, some of which you answered as you went on, but I'm kind of curious because we're asked the same thing. What would be the ideal term of the project for you? What do you think the long-term project actually entails? How long would you need to be collecting?
Yeah, so there are some studies that show that the first impacts to the vines are shown around over 3 years, like around 4 to 5 years. And this is difficult because most of the grants are actually limited to 2 or 3 years. So it doesn't really allow us to see any of these effects.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, right
so
on.
Definitely more than 3 years.
Yeah, just beyond what CDFA is currently funding, but
yeah,
it's good that Davis and Cal Poly are invested in expanding on that.
Yeah.
Looks like we have a question from Steve Baker. Is the timing of tillage key, for example, while still green or after, oh, it just flew away. Is the timing of tillage key, for example, while still green or after it is in decline?
That is a good question. I don't think we know that. I don't think we know that, and from my perspective, I don't think it would matter. I think if the cover crop doesn't directly compete with the vines, which might be the biggest concern, you can let it die and then till it. And because while the cover crop is green, it is still producing root exudates, which are feeding the microbes, which are feeding the whole food web. So there are benefits of having a cover crop alive in your soil. So if there is no direct competition with the vines, I will just let the cover crop die naturally rather than terminate it green. But I'm not aware of any studies that directly evaluate these for soil carbon.
Mm-hmm. So we work with quite a few vineyards in our district, and I've had some conversations along these lines with quite a few of them and the vineyard managers, and anecdotally, things are all over the place. But I'm always kind of curious if certain vineyards seem to have a certain blend of cover crop mix that they like to put out. Do you think that they're down the road is going to be a little bit more focused, and you touched on this in one of your slides, but a little bit more focus on developing a specific cover crop mix tailored for a specific varietal, or even maybe more just tailored to a specific soil type?
Yes, absolutely. I think that it's important to tailor the cover crop mix to the soil type and to the grape varietal. That's a very important. I think that the grape varietal is like the most innovative perspective. So there are cover crops that might include legumes that will increase nitrogen contents to the soil, and so that might be in some certain types of soils something that is beneficial. Certain types of soils where the nitrogen content is already very high may not be as convenient, right? If the concern is retaining nitrogen, then some growers might choose a cover crop that has deeper root systems that capture nitrogen in the rainy season. and which are non-legumes, right? Like more grasses, things like that. If the concern it's compaction or issues with soils that are very heavy, then other types of cover crops which have large root systems and that open pores in the soil might be more beneficial in that case. But I certainly agree with the fact that the cover crop mix will have to be tailored to the specific challenges and needs of that field.
Are there any other questions from the attendees? Feel free to unmute yourselves if you do. Otherwise, we are coming up on noon. I really do appreciate everybody attending. Thank you very much, Dr. Lazcano. I have a lot more questions, but luckily I have your email address, so I can just send them to you. But if we don't have any other further questions, thanks again for your attendance, everyone. And feel free, you have Dr. Lazcano's email address on screen there. You can get in touch with the Resource Conservation District to expand upon anything. And yeah, we appreciate everyone's attendance. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to ask, is the meeting recorded, and will it be, I guess it is recorded, but will it be available to participants?
Liz?
Yeah, I'll be uploading it, and then it'll be available on I'll be uploading it to YouTube, and then we will post it on the RCD's website. And I can forward that link to registrants.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye. Andy, I don't know if you are still recording. I'm going to be visiting the area